legislation and Ed Manning representing Waste Connections.
Okay, thanks. Before we take witnesses, a couple things. We have Assembly members who are here waiting to present their bills, and I want to, just in interest of using their time wisely, want to tell you this is one of the more challenging bills we have today. I say that without prejudice, Assemblymember Ma. And so there isn't a snowball's chance that we're going to get to you in the next half hour. So if you'd like to use that half hour for some other purpose, well, apparently took no more than a subtle hint. Thank you. Then, Ms. Ma, before we hear from your witnesses, what I'd like to do is sort of lay out, and since I'm what we've got for a committee at this point, I'd like to just sort of lay out where I am on the bill, which is decidedly undecided. So I want to lay out what I think are some of the issues. And if we could ask folks in the middle of the aisle, Assembly member, if you could, thanks. I want to lay this out, and I want folks, I'm assuming that there are some folks who are here in opposition to the bill. Could I see a show of hands? Okay, and I assume there's some people who are here in support of the bill. Could I see a show of hands? Okay. Could I ask you all to listen to what I'm about to share with you, because it's going to be important in getting to some of the issues that I think we need to sort through on this complex issue. On the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, I have to tell you, I'm fundamentally not terribly sympathetic to local governments putting up barriers to inter-county commerce. Okay, I mean, I think the author has made the case, and the bill reflects her belief, that we have a statewide system of solid waste management, and there is a problem when individual counties start putting up barriers to the free flow of commerce, whether that commerce involves garbage or anything else, back and forth between and among the various counties. We are one state. We are not 58 balkanized county communities. That being said, I am sympathetic to local control and local government arguments. That being said, I am sympathetic to the fact that there is already on the books a measure that was passed by a local initiative, and we're coming in after the fact. That being said, I am troubled by the fact that while this is a measure that has statewide application, what's really driving us here is a local dispute between two counties, which is currently pending in court, as you've indicated earlier. So, in my perfect world, this might be a 2-year bill while some of these issues get sorted out. I also think, frankly, that there is an unresolved and very complex set of issues between saying, on the one hand, as the bill does, can't discriminate against out-of-county garbage, while on the other hand saying, but nothing we're doing here is designed to impede, inhibit, or limit the land use authority of the local government. I'm guessing I'm going to hear from some of the local government folks that, by its nature, the bill does impede their ability. I'm guessing I'm going to hear from you, Assembly member, and your supporters, no, it says right there in the bill that we're not doing that. So there's a reason I think this is one of the more challenging bills we're going to hear today. I applaud your courage for taking the matter on, and as your witnesses speak and subsequent witnesses speak, happy to hear about other issues as well. But that's the on the one hand, on the other hand, that I, as chair, am trying to sort out. One of the things, I heard you mention the sense of urgency. One of the things I'm going to ask your witnesses to speak to, as well as you, if you'd like, Assembly member, is, so what bad thing happens if we let this be a 2-year bill while we try and sort out some of the language issues that have this tension between local land use control while at the same time containing a prohibition on discrimination based on out-of-county? I hope that was helpful and clarifying rather than more confusing, but that's what I'm trying to sort through, and I don't know where other members will be, but that's a start. Who'd like to begin? And folks, usually we do a couple of witnesses for 2 minutes each and then ask others to do me too. We're going to try the honor system today, which is I'm going to try and ask people to, we're not going to limit it to 2 and 2. I think this one requires a little more conversation, but I'm just going to interrupt you when it starts to go on a little too long. If I go like that, that does not mean wahoo, I'm excited. That means please wrap it up. Okay, that's what that little gesture means. Okay, go to it.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Josh Panay on behalf of the California Refuse Recycling Council, a 50-year young council of over 100 companies, both waste, recycling, management companies. We pride ourselves on the fact that our council has been scavenging for well over 75 years, members of the council, and we continue to recycle today. We focus on Assemblymember Ma's bill, and we appreciate her courage in tackling this issue. As a former member of the City Council in Sacramento and having focused on waste and solid waste and recycling, having helped form the first JPA, having closed the city's landfill, the 100-year landfill that we closed in 1994 when I was on council, I understand these issues from a local government perspective, so I'll address specifically, I've closed my notes, and I'll address specifically your issue of local government, since we do have the counties, the largest urban counties, the smallest rural counties, all now have removed their opposition because we've tried to focus, and the Assembly member has tried to focus with your good offices, the issue of local control. And what we have done is tried to strike that reasonable balance. And we think we've struck it so clearly that perhaps one or two are still confused by the clarity of it. But in the bill, we've specifically stated that there's no attempt at all to stop a local government from citing its landfill and deciding what the rules are for that landfill.
Let me interrupt you then
Yes,
and
sir.
ask you a question, and if the author wants to respond or have any of our witnesses respond, it's helpful. So if I'm looking at page 3 of the bill, and I'm looking at line 19, on the one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand, the language in the bill, June 22nd amended version, a city or county, including by an ordinance enacted by the voters of that city or county, may not otherwise restrict or limit the importation of solid waste into a privately owned facility in that city or county based on the place of origin. Now, that's the guts of the bill, as I understand it. Yes. We go on later in the same page that it says, line 28, this subdivision does not do any of the following, jumping down to line 36, prevent a city or county from exercising its land use authority, including making a zoning, permitting, or other land use determination that is subject to paragraph 1.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What does that mean?
Let's have legal counsel, I think, address that.
Mr. Chair, thank you, Ed Manning, on behalf of Waste Connections. Also with me is Eddie Westmoreland, who's Government Affairs Vice President for the company. We'll talk a little bit about their specific facts in a second. What this means is that the local government has, under existing law, and it's pointed out in the analysis, the ability to develop a general plan, to do specific plans, to make zoning determinations and land use decisions as it chooses. To the extent that they determine that they want to site a landfill, they can put numerous conditions, and do all the time. There are tonnage limits on landfills. There are traffic restrictions on landfills. Routes trucks can go on. Limitations on how many trucks can come in a day. There are air district limitations, et cetera.
So let me stop you there and say, so if it's the, Ms. Wagner, the City Council and the Mayor have duly heard your application for a landfill, general plan consistency, zoning consistency, time to site the facility, can the Mayor and the Council vote in an open and public hearing to say, well, we're going to allow you 100 cubic feet, but we want to reserve 100 cubic feet for the residents of our local community, consistent with your bill?
There's two answers to that. If it's a publicly owned and operated landfill, as opposed to privately owned, we took amendments which make clear publicly owned, operated landfills can reserve 100% of capacity for themselves. If it is a privately owned landfill, we have worked on language which says they can the local government can contract for that space, but if the intent is to discriminate based on the origin of the waste, as opposed to contracting for the landfill capacity themselves, then that would run afoul of the legislation.
Okay, let's just stay on that point for a minute, please. This is as close as I'm ever going to get to the United States Supreme Court, so I just keep going with these questions. So if it's a privately owned facility and we're going through the permitting process and the mayor and the council members lean forward and they say, folks, the reason we carved out this space in our general plan and in our zoning ordinance for a dump, let's call it what it is, for a dump, is because we're going to have garbage here locally that we want to get rid of. And before we approve that 100 cubic feet, we want to make sure that 90 of those 100 cubic feet or 100 of those 100 cubic feet are available for our local community. And we want that to be a condition of approval for your privately owned landfill dump. In your judgment, does the bill allow them to do that?
Yes.
For a privately owned site?
Yes, can I speak to that?
Go ahead.
Please.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I'm Eddie Westmoreland, Vice President of Governmental Affairs for Waste Connections. And just on behalf of the industry, what I would say is, yes, it does allow that. The bill does allow for that. As a private facility developer and operator, we would have to determine whether that is economical for us to open a landfill under those circumstances, if it's, a small amount of waste, and would determine whether or not that makes that facility economical or not for us to operate and provide those services to that local community.
But
We
let me
may
stop you,
choose
Mr.
as an
Westmoreland.
Sure.
I apologize, but I'm determined to get this clear. So it's your understanding, and the author is nodding her head indicating that it is her intent, that even as to a privately owned solid waste facility, that notwithstanding the language that says may not otherwise restrict or limit importation of solid waste into a privately owned facility, that a local jurisdiction would retain the authority as part of its approval process to condition the approval on the acceptance of some defined amount of local waste.
Some defined amount of waste.
Excuse me, but the word local is sort of key to the conversation we're having.
And what that would require is some type of an agreement between the facility operator and the local jurisdiction.
No, hang on a second. That's
Okay,
not the question
sure.
I asked. I
Mr.
didn't ask
Chair.
about an agreement. I asked about whether or not this bill is intended to prohibit that as a condition of approval. Because you have two different paragraphs that are trying to accommodate two different goals. One is the prohibition on discrimination against out-of-county waste. Another is, hey, we still respect your land use rights. And I'm trying to find out how you've managed to blend the two with what result. So we're talking about privately owned facilities. We're talking about not an agreement, a contract at arm's length, but we're talking about conditions of approval, which would be a legislative action or a quasi-judicial or administrative action of some kind.
That's right.
By your local government. And my question is it your understanding that the language as written allows them to do that? To say, we're going to reserve it. Could be, let's just make it the most dramatic case. You want 100 cubic feet, great, we're going to approve it, but we're going to condition it on you taking 100 cubic feet worth of, we want to reserve that for our local folks.
Yes, the answer is you can reserve the space and condition the issuance of a permit. The applicant for that permit under an administrative or under the local land use authority by the county or city gets to have their public process and exercise their police powers. And as a facility developer, we would have to determine whether we could move forward with that type of a
So if I were to
project.
say to you, it seems to me that allowing the land use authority to remain in place defeats the purpose of the bill, because by allowing the land use authority to stay in place, you can do an end around the prohibition by simply saying, well, we're only going to approve enough space for our own local needs, and we're going to condition the use of that space for our own local needs. You would say, well, it's a bit of an end around, but it's not a total end around, because ultimately we could walk away and say, if that's the way you're going to do it, we don't find that economically viable and we're not going to move forward.
That's correct.
Okay.
So it's not a total end around.
All right. What else would you like to share?
Okay. Well, I think that line of questioning answered a number of the issues raised in section, I think it's section 5 of the
Well,
analysis.
let me. I apologize, but let me Columbo you for a minute here, if I may.
Sure.
One more thing, which is, so if you can get to the same place largely by simply putting these provisions in any new approval, does the legislation have any tangible impact except as to existing facilities and a prohibition on existing facilities? I mean, is this really about saying for holes that are already in the ground or that we intend to dig, you can't discriminate, but going forward, people will be able to discriminate as long as they do it artfully through their land use process.
Mr. Chair, I guess what it comes down to, the crux of it is if we have an existing facility or we're trying to permit a new facility or re-permit an existing and expand an existing facility, we have to have the ability to know that once we jump through all those public processes, and we're not talking about undermining the local land use authority, but once we jump through those hoops and we take possibly years to permit one of these facilities and we're issued a permit for X amount of capacity, we may reserve X amount for the local jurisdiction as appropriate, and we may have X amount of surplus capacity over and above that. We need to know that if we're making investment as the industry, that we can recover our capital investment that we're making in those facilities to serve the public need.
So your view is once the land use authority has been exercised,
right,
whatever conditions of approval you've agreed to,
right,
you want to make sure that essentially the understanding that is a part of that approval is not subsequently put aside either by an initiative or by subsequent vote of the council or county board of supervisors.
That someone can't come back to us and pull the rug out from underneath the project at that point after we've jumped through all of the public process up front and or later upon trying to expand an existing facility and get an
why
answer
does this
to expand.
Why does this bill, Ms. Ma or witnesses, why does this bill need to move forward today as opposed to next year? What bad thing happens to the state of California if we don't take action on the bill until next year?
Well, I think the urgency is the court case and that it could jeopardize all or some of the existing contracts out there. And that's what their concern is, not only existing ones, but pending ones, people who have gone through the approvals, ready to, be cited or expand, and now...
So your point is, yeah, this may be about one dispute, but it's also about the fact that if the court decides that basically people can, in fact, discriminate across county lines, that it gums up the works for the whole state of California more or less overnight?
Well, that, but also the ability for local cities and counties to put initiatives on the ballot, let's say November, saying, Solano, passed it, so let's do that, in Kern or Yuba or...
So if we think here in the state that that's a bad policy, we better take action sooner rather than later to avoid a proliferation of these bad policies.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's correct. And if I can add,
Please.
Mr. Chair, this Measure E, as you've seen in your analysis, was passed back in 1984 to stop the Lynch Canyon landfill in Solano County. The landfill was never built and never operated, so it was successful in that regard. Now, Measure E is not only affecting the Potrero Hills landfill, which is owned by Waste Connections, and was purchased as a result of the Allied Waste and Republic Services merger a couple of years ago, a requirement that was set forth by the AG and the Department of Justice, maintaining high levels of competition in the state. We purchased that facility, but it's also applying to the Recology Hay Road landfill in Solano County, as well as their organics recycling facility that takes up to 400 to 500 tons per day of organics waste. So it applies not only to solid waste disposal facilities, but as well as to recycling facilities and the free flow of waste statewide. So it really, truly is of an urgent nature for us to pass this law. And right now, the business aspects affecting our particular site are we can't renew contracts with municipal customers because per their plans, they have to provide so many years of capacity and be able to demonstrate to have their plan be compliant with state law.
But if I'm a local jurisdiction, if I'm the county board of supervisors, and I say, look, we've only got so much. It's our responsibility as a local county board of supervisors, or Madam Mayor over there and her city council. We got a plan for the future. We have laid this out in our general plan. We've laid it out in our zoning ordinance. We think we've managed the problem reasonably well. And then somebody from out of town, out of county comes in and says, we're going to buy up all the space. How then, if local jurisdictions can't protect themselves against that, how are they ever supposed to plan for solid waste disposal on a citywide or countywide basis?
Actually, to be able to contract for those services, and that's what most jurisdictions do now, to be able to lock in their rates, to have certainty on their economic pricing, and then the companies have certainty that they can be able to recapture their investment in those types of facilities when they are actually building and operating those facilities to serve the public interest.
So your argument is that the land use may be the vehicle by which we facilitate and accommodate all of this, but ultimately that the responsibility of the local jurisdiction is to contract for what they need to make sure that they have what they need.
Absolutely. Just like when we go to the grocery store, we buy the amount of groceries we require to sustain our families.
And Mr. Chair, if I might want to add one thing, I mean, the practical reality is it is a two-part analysis. I mean, if they can use their land use authority to reserve X amount of capacity, but the practical reality on the business side is if there isn't a corresponding contractual commitment, you're going to have to make a business decision of whether that economic model works or not. Okay. And as a practical reality, the local governments usually will contract for it, so they have certainty.
Typically, it's not the inclination of the legislature to insert itself in a pending legal matter. Why do you think that we should in this case? Again, either to the author or to her witnesses.
I think there's several issues. I think if we've submitted to the committee the opinion of Brian Gregory, who had opined numerous years ago that the measure was unconstitutional.
Let me interrupt, though. Wait a minute. I've got. I just happen to have a copy of the Legislative Council's opinion dated August 19th, 1992, and it's very clear from their opinion that they thought it was unconstitutional solely on the interstate commerce issues, did not address any inter-county issues. So keep going.
Well, under the Dormant Commerce Clause in the U.S. Supreme Court decision cited in that opinion, the U.S. Supreme Court actually reached that issue and said a prohibition on inter-county disposal of waste is unconstitutional, and that's cited in Mr. Gregory's opinion.
I'm going to ask you to highlight that for us after we finish the remarks.
Sure.
Because I have a slightly different take on it. Go
okay.
ahead.
And the second issue, I think, Mr. Simidian, goes to really what you addressed in the opening, which is the Integrated Waste Management Act itself really addresses one circumstance where a local government can be prohibited from contracting or sending its waste out of that jurisdiction, and that's if it isn't not in compliance, its plan is not in compliance with the Integrated Waste Management Act. There are also numerous findings, I've addressed some of them in my letter, where the legislature in the passage of the Integrated Waste Management Act actually encouraged regional cooperation and regionalization. That was what was envisioned because, as you will recall, prior to the IWMA passing, we had local dumps and we had severe environmental problems, we had planning problems, et cetera. So, I mean, that's the legal and statutory framework. And then I think Mr. Westmoreland can address the fact that there are real-life complications currently.
Yeah, thanks,
I'm
Ed.
going to ask that we take just 2 more minutes, wrap it up, and then I want to give roughly equal time to a conversation with folks on the other side after we hear from other witnesses on a much briefer basis who are in support. Go right ahead.
Mr. Chair Simidian, it really boils down to can we operate with a valid permit in hand and serve our customers and not wait until there's a potential crisis generated on behalf of our customers who are all sending us waste based on our repository acting as their receiving facility. And can we do that in such a way that we have certainty? So when their contracts come due for renewal, we're not waiting for a court decision. The rest of the state that might be under, other areas in the state might be under the same circumstances are not waiting for a court decision that could set a horrible precedent and send the system into potential chaos. We've got the opportunity right now to have the good open policy debate to really vet this subject and to make a good policy decision that's sound and serves the state's solid waste needs and helps us increase recycling. You referred to our landfill. Modern landfills today are not just dumps, but we actually operate our landfill as an environmental park. We actually recover a number of materials once they come through the gate. If they're not recovered on the front end of the solid waste collection system, we still divert those materials once they come through our gates. We collect metals, we collect e-waste, we collect wood waste, we collect asphalt, concrete, and put all of those things to use. So we recover as many materials, and we would invite any of the committee members and yourself to come out and take a look at our facilities. Modern landfills today have really changed from what most people's conceptions of the old-fashioned dump is in the past. And they're an integral part, whether we like them or not. Our company supports zero waste, the concept of zero waste. We do a lot to aggressively recycle the waste streams out there.
Let me ask if your witnesses would step away for a minute, unless there's and then ask for other witnesses in support.
So can I just add
Absolutely.
a couple things? So the Measure E in Solano County took place in 1984. And subsequently, in 1989, the legislature passed the Integrated Waste Management Act, I think foreseeing that this may be a future problem. So it's been kind of status quo since 1989. Now, opponents have brought up the court case, and that's why we're sitting here today. I also want to point out that the Solano County Board of Supervisors has consistently voted to support their landfills. 30% of its waste is actually exported to 12 different counties. This is Solano County themselves. So the board, Solano County, has consistently voted to support their landfills. They receive about $4 million in taxes on the disposal. So this, again, we're going to talk about Solano County now, and I know the opponents are going to come up.
Mr. Chair, can I have one more thing? And this is the last point.
2 sentences, please.
This is unique also because the Attorney General solicited Waste Connections to buy this asset to keep the Northern California waste disposal market competitive. And the policy implications of the Attorney General stepping in, trying to make sure markets are competitive, then having someone make an enormous investment and then not be able to basically operate their business is very significant.
Two things, and then I'm going to step away from the desk. The first is, I think these last couple of comments are an indication of just how complicated it gets when we have what is essentially a local dispute blended in a piece of legislation that has statewide significance, and that's sort of, if we had a sorting center, maybe we'd be able to pull them apart, but that's part of the challenge. And then, Mr. Manning, I am going to ask you to take a look at the opinion, if you've got a copy, and highlight the language that you think addresses the issue of inter-county legality and constitutionality.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other witnesses in support, briefly, please. Other witnesses in support.
Barry Broad with the Teamsters, Mr. Chair, in support.
Thank you. Next witness. Come on up, folks. Welcome.
Mr. Chair, thank you. My name is Chuck Tim. I'm the Vice Mayor, City of Fairfield. And the landfill that we're talking about is adjacent to my city and the city of Suisun City. Right now, we are involved in negotiations with a garbage company, and our rates are predicated on the rates that they will be charged from the landfill. And we're looking at probably in the area of $120 to $130 million contract. This has been going on now for a long time, and our city is in support of the bill.
What bad thing will happen to your city if the bill doesn't pass?
If the bill doesn't pass, it could change our rates that we're negotiating for our ratepayers for the city. It will also take the dump, as you call it, and probably make it worth nothing. It'll go from whatever it's worth now, millions, to nothing.
Thank you. Next witness.
Mike Segala, City of Suisun City. I am supporting Councilman, and I am supporting AB 1178. I live in the area just more or less adjacent to the landfill. I see it every day from Suisun City when I'm traveling, no matter what I do. And the biggest thing is they have been a very cooperative organization. It is always great to have something that close. When we're looking at having to travel to landfills, I know what it's like back in Massachusetts, where I was born and raised. This is a very viable facility, and it definitely needs to get the support.
Great. Where are you from in Massachusetts?
Northwestern Mass, in North Adams, Mass, right in the Berkshires, right in the heart.
Right. Welcome. Thank you, Council Member. Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Next witness. 4 witnesses, please.
Thanks, sir.
Any other witnesses in support? Neutral. Fine.
Mr. Chairman, members, Paul Smith with the Regional Council of Rural Counties, representing the boards of supervisors of 30 rural counties, and I also speak on behalf of the California State Association of Counties, representing all the counties. Like you, Senator Simitian, we struggled greatly with this bill for the last several months. We've had a number of extensive conversations, and ultimately we have removed our opposition, as Ms. Moss said in her testimony. We went through the exercise that I think you just did before the proponents of the bill, trying to see really where things fall, and we came to a point where we wanted to achieve the same balance that I think you spoke to, which is we have many counties that rely on other counties to accept their waste, and we need to treat it as such, that it is a regional matter, as a state matter. We also wanted to make sure that we still had local government land use tools and preserve our capacity for our host jurisdictions. I will say that the language in the bill is not perfect. I think everyone would agree this will probably be tested somewhere at some court at some point of time, but it was our opinion that this bill, with the recent amendments, that it satisfied those concerns. I will say that regardless of whether this bill moves forward or it becomes a 2-year bill, amending this bill to a point where we feel weakens our position over land use authority and maintaining our capacity will trigger us back into opposition. I know there are a number of proponents that are still very concerned about the language written, and we are too. And so we would encourage that if this bill moves forward or it stays in the committee for a 2-year bill, that we work on the language. We're going to be very, very sensitive to the way it is crafted.
Thank you very much. Any other witnesses who are either in support or neutral? If not, witnesses in opposition, and if we could ask the witnesses to sort of figure out who the 3 or 4 folks are that might want to come up together at the beginning and have the same kind of conversation that we had a little earlier, that would be helpful.
Mr. Chair, we've tried to do this. Michael Endicott on behalf of Sierra Club California. Some folks have gotten together to try and talk about particular local aspects and some of the details. I wanted to address. I should wait.
Why don't we wait just a minute? Okay. All right. Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to do 2 banks of 3. So I'm going to ask the next 3 to quietly wrestle that out behind the first 3. And if we're doing a quick substitution here, that's fine. And we'll take another 3 in a minute or 2, and then we'll have just quote others who will have a sentence or 2. All right. Everybody square? So I think you heard some of the questions or issues that I raised earlier. Why don't we ask you to go ahead and begin, but please try and be responsive to the issues that have been raised, because ultimately those are going to be the basis for at least the chair's decision.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Michael Endicott on behalf of Sierra Club California. I will going to narrow my comments down to just talking about some of the land use aspects, because I think there's actually 2 major policies you're dealing with here. There is a solid waste policy that you're discussing, but there is also a fundamental land use policy that you're going to go and retroactively change. Land use has been viewed as a local issue. I think you laid that point out very well. But there is a component of it.
Go just a little slower. We're not working on 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Okay.
I want to make sure that I can process what you're sharing. Go to it.
Part of the reason for having the SEQA review and the local participation and process involves the finish of that. And that gives the people have always had a say through referendum in their land use decisions as well. And they've also had it in challenges through the courts in SEQA if you don't think the law is being followed or applied correctly. When, in this case, the local citizenry has made a decision that now, with this big expansion of the landfill and all, that they're not following the law of a local decision passed dutifully by the people that gave an indication as to what their will and intentions of how their land use should be carried out. And this bill would go back and retroactively change that. It's very problematic. You're changing land use law as well as solid waste management law. If you want to go and reform or lay down a clear or a different state policy than we've had to this date, then that's something we always welcome, all of us environmental groups and local land use groups. But this bill, as everybody admits, has problems in it, and it's unclear in its interpretation.
Mr. Endicott, let me interrupt for a minute. I take your point about retroactivity. On the other hand, it's a little hard to know what retroactive means in the case of a measure that was passed in '84 but then wasn't applied for a quarter of a century. I mean, at this point, what's the beginning and what's the end?
Well, they laid out a very clear indication to the leaders and their decision makers as to what the policy should be. There was a decision here that happened that actually changed the name of the game in such a significant way that the public had to take them to court and say, enough is enough. This is what the law is. This is what we have for our land use, and that has to do with the great expansion of this land use facility. with all due respect to the opinions of the Lead Counsel and the AG's office, this case has already gone to court, and there have been 2 judicial decisions on the points that the supporters have raised on this issue. So it's not as if that, we haven't even already gone part of the way down the process in the judicial decision. Does this conflict with the Commerce Clause, either at an interstate way or at a local level? And that should be allowed to be played out. The other reason is that when you step in here and there are some witnesses here that can testify how this could have real applications to other contracts here on the ground. And so I guess I'm just going to shorten this and give you time to move on. This bill, any bill that you call statewide policy reform or clarification that actually has to exempt almost everybody except the public in one way of weighing in on the decision is not a good policy to lay down retroactively.
All right. So I take your point about the fact that there's a court case pending. I take your point about retroactivity. Let's go back to land use and the limits thereof. So if the city or county said, you know what, we don't like to be bothered by noise and traffic and density, but we're going to approve a 20-unit condominium project, but only for graduates of our local school system, because we don't want to attract a bunch of people from out of the area, what would you say to that? Was that an appropriate exercise of their land use authority?
It depends on how they're applying the terms, and if there's a difference in the way the waste might be coming in terms of how we handle solid waste, where is the source of the waste can have different characteristics as the kind of waste going into your landfill.
Look, land use decisions are about impacts on local communities, and we, in order to protect the general health, safety, and welfare of the community, we give our local jurisdictions the ability to regulate land use. Now, folks have said, look, if there's a dump, whatever we're calling it, if there's a dump, there are some impacts, and we frankly don't want to be importing impacts from other places to our community. I get that argument. But my point is, so if you don't want the adverse impacts of growth and development, does that mean you're allowed to say we're only going to allow housing to be built, even though we've zoned for it, and even though we've got it in our general plan, and even though it's a private developer with no public funds? Does that mean we're only going to allow housing to be built if it's for local people? We're not going to allow people from outside the county or the city to come and fill up those housing units, since we're the ones going to be bearing the burden? Well,
we do have already in land use law, for instance, in low income and moderate income housing, trying to say you have to put into your land use plans ways of coping with low income housing, because that's of a critical statewide interest.
Not my question. My question again is, if it's a private facility, does the local land use authority allow you to say, or should it allow you to say in your judgment, we only want it to serve local needs. We don't want anybody from outside our area to come.
Well, the way I read this bill, it says that if the person who owned that property wanted to put that restriction on the property, they could. This exempts that person who owns that property from the law, the application of the land use law.
Respectfully, that's 3 times I didn't get an answer to the question.
Sorry,
so let's ask the other witnesses as well. I mean, it's... Well, why don't we go ahead and just let you make your presentations, and then I'll follow up with questions.
Okay. Do you want to go second, Mark?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, members, Mark Murray with the Environmental Group Californians Against Waste, and we're opposed to the language in the current bill. This issue this bill is putting 3 distinct issues on the table, and we are sympathetic to the intent of the proponents on one of those issues. With regard to a situation where a local government has approved a disposal capacity for a private facility, coming in afterwards, after that investment has been made, and changing the rules of the game so that they couldn't accept waste from some other jurisdiction. These solid waste facilities, in order to protect the environment, public health and the environment, a considerable amount of investment has to be made. Once that investment is predicated on a volume of waste coming in, when the price of that facility is based on that size and that flow of waste. To change the rules of the game after that permit has been approved and after that investment is made, that would be wrong, and we're sympathetic to the proponents on that one aspect of the issue.
Mr. Murray, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just so I understand your argument. Your argument is that if the committee were inclined to move the bill forward, take favorable action, you would like to see it apply prospectively and not, to use Mr. Endicott's word, retroactively to prior decisions that have already been made.
I guess what we're looking for, what would be acceptable to us is something that protects those investments, those approvals that have been made by a local agency. at the two ends are, what can a community do going forward in the future? Is it appropriate for a community to say, the Integrated Waste Management Act requires communities to plan for a specific 15 years worth of disposal capacity. We can imagine it being appropriate for a community to say, as Solano County did 27 years ago, we don't want our county to be a host to regional landfills. We are sending a signal. Whether we get the language correct in drafting this initiative, we've sent a signal to our elected officials that we don't want this community to become a host to regional landfills.
Let me stop you again, please, just again, because I'm trying to track your arguments. So I think a poor choice of words on my part, using prospective and retroactive. Your point earlier about what you were sympathetic to is that where there are already facilities that have been approved and operations underway, having after the fact prohibitions about content to be received, whether from an initiative or a council or a board of supervisors, is, in your view, problematic, and you're sympathetic on that score. That being said,
we would have no objection. If that was all the bill was doing, we would have no objection to that.
But your concern, both going back to 84, is people knew that that measure had been passed and took action subsequent to that, which is inconsistent with 84. And going forward, you don't want to inhibit the ability of local folks to make local choices about what they want in their local community.
That's exactly correct.
And then how do you respond to the concerns that I've raised earlier about what happens if people start to essentially put up barriers to the flow of commerce between counties?
Well, this is solid waste. This is garbage. This is, and frankly, it doesn't matter whether it's garbage from San Francisco or Davis or Solano County. It's all nasty garbage, and nobody really wants to have these facilities in their backyard. The policy we had to adopt was that one that actually compelled jurisdictions to plan for 15 years of disposal capacity in their own community.
The author said actually that Solano County's understanding that the representatives may have a different point of view than the citizenry did almost 30 years ago, does want to have some of these facilities, if I understand the argument correctly, and I think we heard from two council members who said that they view having these resources in their community as an upside, both in terms of having a local place to dump and also as a source of revenue, and also as a way to keep costs down, if I'm characterizing your remarks correctly, gentlemen.
I think that's the saddest part of this whole thing, that the elected officials in Solano County absolutely ignored the will of the people. After the citizens voted, whether they got the language right or not, they ignored that clear intent of the voters to not be a host to regional facilities. And then, after the fact, established, permitted a regional disposal facility. Frankly, I don't blame the proponents who've made an investment based on the word of the elected officials. The elected officials in Solano County in the era of the late 1980s are the ones that screwed up and ignored the will of the people, and frankly, that's why we've had this battle going on for 30 years, because those elected officials blew it. Now, I'm sympathetic to this solid waste facility owner that is responding to a directive from the state of California. We want to divest these landfills. We don't want one company that has recently merged to own all this disposal capacity, and this company stepped up.
Let me ask you if you have any other points, because I want to go on to the next witness. I want to make sure we include folks. I see a lot of folks standing.
I think I'm good.
Next witness. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Dwayne Crom. I'm a former Solano County supervisor, and Potrero Hills landfill was in my district when I was on the Board of Supervisors.
Did you screw up?
Did I screw up? Well, probably a lot, but I don't know if on this issue I did. You decide. I kind of wrote my notes down that in many ways I want to apologize to you guys. We're talking about one initiative in one county, largely affecting one landfill, and we're taking up an enormous amount of space and capacity in state legislature time. I don't get that, to tell you the truth. I can understand the owners of the landfill being quite concerned about their profitability, but in terms of taking up state resources to kind of sort this out, we've got a court process that's well underway. We're off to appellate court in the state appellate court because our argument from the Sierra Club and related environmental organizations is that Measure E is constitutional. I was frankly stunned when I was on the Board of Supervisors to learn about Measure E. I had forgotten about it, and I've lived in Solano County a long time. It passed in 1984. What doesn't get mentioned much is that there was actually a companion measure at the same time both passed, and there's a kind of a big backstory to that. But Measure E wasn't the source of the argument. Measure E was the secondary measure. The main measure was a referendum of a piece of land that had been bought by a San Francisco garbage company to make into a landfill, and the County Board of Supervisors did the general plan amendments to change it, and it was referended. And there's big backstory to all this stuff. So Measure E was a community response to a problem that the Solano County folks saw as a coming flood of garbage coming into Solano County from not just San Francisco but across the region. And it was abundantly clear in all the campaign materials that this was a regional issue. This was not interstate commerce, it was intrastate commerce. It's just clear as a bell. The environmental documents, the CEQA documents supporting the expansion of Potrero Hills landfill make it abundantly clear this is an intra-county or inter-county, not interstate issue. They talk about in their environmental documents that it's a service area of approximately 150 miles. So the constitutional questions, I mean, we think are pretty well settled, and the courts are agreeing with us. And we'd like to see that court process continue. And we think it'll settle out probably within a year or so. We expect the appellate court hearing to be held by sometime before the end of this year. A couple of other issues.
Let me interrupt with a quick question, if I may. I apologize. You were a county supervisor in Solano.
Yes.
From when to when, if I may ask?
I started in 1999, and my term ended in 2006. 8 years.
And then I thought I heard the author or somebody else say earlier that, in fact, Solano exports a significant amount of garbage these days to other counties. Is that correct?
Oh, sure. I mean, sure.
And how would you feel about it if those counties said, we're not taking your garbage from Solano?
Well, I would be just pleased as punch, because there's plenty of capacity in Potrero Hills landfill to take largely the garbage from the cities of Vallejo and the city of Benicia. Those are the two large exporting cities.
Is there capacity there only if you no longer take San Francisco's garbage? Or is there...
Fair enough. Depends for how long.
Okay.
There's a considerable amount of capacity in the expansion proposal for Potrero Hills landfill, which has been pretty well settled now. Not totally, but pretty well settled. There would be significant capacity to handle all of Solano County garbage for many, many decades. And frankly, I think every county, every city should do everything within its capacity to avoid trucking garbage all over the state of California.
I'm going to ask Ms. Ma to wait until you finished your testimony, then I'm going to let her respond a little bit, and then we're going to go on to other witnesses.
Okay.
So go right ahead.
Just one last thing. So the question about, won't all counties be saying no? I mean, you've already heard from two of our local city councilmen here in Solano County that like having Solano Potrero Hills landfill and the work they do and the support they do in the community. There's revenues that flow to Solano County. There's 3 members of the Board of Supervisors that have consistently voted for the expansion of Potrero Hills landfill. I think that's a pretty clear message that in a lot of counties and in a lot of communities, they're going to want landfills. It's going to be a revenue-generating source. And there's going to be some counties and some cities that are going to say, no, we don't want landfills. It could be for environmental reasons, or it could be a number of different reasons. And I think that the economics of the landfill business will sort itself out over time in terms of who wants them, who doesn't want them, who gets money, and who doesn't get money. I think it's a process that has worked throughout the state for a fair number of years now. And again, this is one initiative, one county, essentially one landfill, and I'm sorry we're taking up so much of your time over this.
I'm not bored, I'll tell you that.
It's not boring, no.
Ms. Ma?
So as I understand, the initiative was a result of one landfill which never got cited, and subsequently other property later on was purchased and cited, so not the one that Measure E was intended to stop. Also, in terms of dumps, there are different types of dumps, right? So some accept solid waste, some accept composting, some accept toxic materials, some accept construction debris and tires. So it's not like you put one dump in and it can take all of it. I mean, that's why we have all these regional issues, and Solano County, as I believe, receives waste from 18 different jurisdictions from 6 different counties. So Solano County is also part of this regional solution, and we need everyone to work on this together and not just say,
All right. I'm going to ask both the author and the witnesses to direct their comments to the chair and the committee, and I'm going to ask the witness if you'll make way for our next witness, please. Thank you.
Just one last thing. It wasn't Measure E did not mention Lynch Canyon. Measure E was a broad policy statement. It was Measure L that blocked Lynch Canyon, a separate measure.
Thank you. Who's next?
I suppose that's me. Mr. Chairman, Senators. Kelly Smith, I'm representing a small environmental group called SPRAWLDEF. We're the ones that originally sued to enforce Measure E, and we've been opposing the expansion of Potrero Hills landfill in the environmentally precious Sisseton Marsh. My main theme here was that the worst thing about this bill is it's being proposed in a policy void. We, in fact, have no statewide policy for regional landfills. There's no such thing in law, statute, or in the Integrated Waste Management Act. In fact, it is based on local county planning, and there's very little to relate one county's planning to another county's planning. We've litigated over this. And that's been one of our great concerns about what's happening in Solano County, is they ignored the fact that all this waste, 85%, is coming in from around the Bay Area without even thinking about the implications to a community that's losing revenue to its recycling program, for example. And so one of the things that's come out in the process is the fact that there is no problem right now, that everything is actually working quite well. There was a B article. I'd like to distribute it to the
Sure. And what I'm going to ask you to do is hand it to our staff, and
Thank you.
She'll make it available to the community.
And I've highlighted the fact there's 1.5 billion tons in excess capacity. Now, you'll hear from others that that's not the same from region to region. It varies. And that's an important issue. That's important information that we should know before we let this bill impose a statewide policy, which is what the effect would be. County integrated planning is something that's really begged for by the change in realities from 1989 when the Integrated Waste Management Act was passed, and we thought everybody had their own little landfill, to one where there are large landfills. They're expanding all the time, and they're looking to suck in waste from other jurisdictions. That is a reality. How do we deal with it?
Now, let me just stop you. If I heard your message, and I think I did, it's we shouldn't be taking this single isolated step on a statewide policy basis absent consideration of both the changing environment in California and in the absence of regional planning for waste management issues around the state.
Yes, sir.
Got it. Next point, please.
And if we go forward doing it this way, the unintended consequences could make it much, much worse.
What are those unintended consequences?
For example, if public landfills are accepted from this bill, for example, doesn't that mean that a community is going to have to go even further if they place restrictions on their landfill to a private one that isn't allowed those kind of restrictions?
Well, hang on a second. Let's be clear about public versus private. The bill, Ms. Ma, addresses
Both.
But the prohibition says that a city, county, including by an ordinance enacted by the voters, may not otherwise restrict or limit the importation of solid waste into a privately owned facility. So the real focus is on private, yes?
Right.
Okay, because of the publicly owned ones, you're going to do with what you do with.
The underlying statewide concern here is that if one community needs a place to dispose of its waste, it needs some place to go to. Now, I would contend everything's working fine now on a market basis. There is no disaster. You're not going to hear of any other problem besides Solano County. But that said,
all right. Well, but let me ask you a question. You oppose the bill,
correct?
Okay. And you're from Solano County.
No.
No?
We're the members of the board of directors are from the Bay Area, in fact.
Okay. And I understand the argument about context and policy. Mm-hmm. What bad thing will happen to the state of California if we vote the bill out today?
The many restrictions and conditions and so forth that exist currently, and you may hear more of those, but those would be in question or wiped out.
Now, when you say many, do you mean other than prohibitions on importation of out-of-county waste? Because if so,
No.
What are those?
Well, some of them aren't directly prohibitions on out-of-county waste. They restrict the capacity to a waste shed, for example, that we want this reserved for our needs. Sunshine Canyon is a big example. I was involved in that expansion. It was very highly controversial, and it's a private landfill. in the end, in the agreement reached with the public, the opponents, the political powers that be down in Los Angeles, limited it to a waste shed in the county, for example. What's going to happen to that?
Did they do that as part of the conditions of approval?
Right.
All right. Now, let me look both to the author and to her witnesses over her shoulder. Is it the intention of the legislation to affect conditions of approval that are attached to a particular application?
No.
No. Okay, and the witnesses are back there agreeing that that's not the intent of the language. Okay, so your intent is to make sure that that neither by a vote of a local governing body or by a public initiative are there prohibitions on the importation of out-of-county waste, but you're not arguing that somehow this would affect the ability or the ongoing viability of conditions of approval to provide that. Okay, back to you, sir.
And myself not understanding the distinction there when you're limiting it to what we need, which is only in the jurisdiction, not out of the jurisdiction. The other thing is I wanted to address the chairman's hypothetical about a community reserving its capacity, which we talked about before. And I thought the response was, as we say politely, disingenuous. I'm a competitor of the landfill that wants to get cited and agrees to make it a condition that that the waste there would only be limited to the jurisdiction, for example. I'm going to sue under this act, and I'm probably going to win.
Okay, next witness, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair, my name is Mike Mahajer, and I'm the commissioner with the Los Angeles County Solid Waste Committee. I used to work those days that I worked for money for Los Angeles County, and I'm lead staff person that permitted the Pointy Hills landfill, largest landfill in California and the state, followed up with the Sunshine Canyon landfill that the reference was made.
Your argument is?
And our argument is that the proposed bill, the way it is written, the restriction on importation that we have on a privately operated landfill, the existing language will void all those restrictions, regardless of what I hear from the author or people from the Waste Connection.
And let me just interrupt. And the restrictions that you're talking about, though, are in conditions of approval?
That is correct, in the CUP.
Okay, keep going.
That's number one. It is not in the language of the bill. Okay. And number two, the system has been working, at least for the time that I've been involved with the solid waste for over 35 years. The system, as far as the disposal is concerned, has been working fine. There has not been any problem in the past. And this is the first time, at least that I have experienced the Measure E that issue is being raised over here. And again, the question comes up, the case is in the court. The court ultimately is going to make the decision. And as you suggested, making the bill a 2-year bill and to see what happens between now and the next January, next February, that would be a better time that everybody gets everything all digested, the language modified, and working as a group to come up to a solution.
Okay, thank you. Next witness.
Mr. Chair, Justin Malone on behalf of Alameda County Waste Management Authority. Many of the points have been made, so I don't want to re-echo. Simply want to amplify one point, and that is from Alameda County, we have a grave concern that where the state or the legislature steps in to rescue a business decision, now that a condition that they knew about, the vote of the people they knew about, whatever the legal status was, it was there on the books, it's been there for a long time. They're now coming to seek protection through the legislature to protect that business decision. And we feel from Alameda County is concerned that this is going to undermine their efforts of the recycling, reuse, recovery efforts of their jurisdictions and other jurisdictions when this is opened up. So just want to make a fine point on that and urge that the bill be held for 2 years while the court process runs its route.
Thank you. Next witness.
Good afternoon, Chair. Kiara Ross on behalf of the League of California Cities, and we are currently in opposition to the bill. I will say that this is still a subject of large amount of discussion within our organization. We went back to Policy Committee for the second time, and we are going to our board in 2 weeks, specifically over the question of the ban. We have a number of communities that feel very strongly that this ought to be a local discussion, and that while it may be appropriate to ban in some areas, it's probably not appropriate in others. And so a lot of this has come down to whether or not you are a host jurisdiction versus an exporter, which is, probably what most people would think. But we remain concerned about the effect of this bill on other communities and how that might affect future decisions and the ability to make those decisions and to work with the solid waste in their communities and how that may play out when it's extremely difficult at this point to site a new landfill. And with that, we remain opposed at this point, although we are very thankful for the extensive amount of discussion we've had with the sponsors in the author's office.
Thanks. Next witness.
Tressa Wallace on behalf of the California chapters of the Solid Waste Association of North America. I'd like to echo the comments made by my previous colleagues, and we do remain opposed for the reasons previously stated, but do appreciate the efforts of the sponsors and the author to try to address our concerns. Thank you.
Next witness.
David Tam, Northern California Recycling Association, and associated with SPRALDEF as one of its directors. Committee members, cheap landfilling is the enemy of recycling. There is a superabundance of landfill capacity in the Bay Area, which is the largest region of Northern California. I believe the gentleman, Mr. Mohajer from Los Angeles area, can attest to the abundance of capacity there. This is a bill that does not remedy a public problem. It seeks to remedy the problem of one speculative corporation which bought a white elephant landfill. I'm having your clerk distribute to your members the tonnage that is gathered from all over the Bay Area and beyond by the Potrero Hills landfill. As much as 850,000 tons outside the county, 85% of all the wastes in the year 2007, the peak year. I can only say that many counties, such as Alameda County, Marin County, San Francisco, Santa Clara County, and San Mateo County, and Sonoma County are making strong efforts by various forms of increases in solid waste fees to ramp up recycling and composting. But
Sir, if I could, forgive me, but if you could just now try and tie those observations together with the bill and say, and the reason that the bill should be opposed in your view is because?
The reason the bill should be opposed is it will open up and make vulnerable programs in the other counties that are making a very strong effort to exceed the goals, which we hope will be raised this year with Assemblyman Chesbro's bill, AB 341, to get beyond the 50% of the 20-some-year-old statute.
So you see it as a disincentive to effective recycling efforts around the Bay Area?
It facilitates further and prolongs the existence of what is a cut rate mega dump whose tipping fees are $15 to $20 per ton less than those of landfills in the other 14 landfills in the 9 Bay Area counties.
Thank you. Next witness, please.
I'm Dr. Richard Paskowitz with the Yuba Group Against Garbage. Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Zoe Lidstrom on behalf of the Planning and Conservation League. I do want to apologize. We sent a letter in, but it didn't make it in time for the analysis, so our apologies. But for the reasons stated previously, we oppose this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other witnesses in opposition? Any other witnesses in opposition? All right. Assemblymember Ma, back to you.
Thank you. So coming from San Francisco, I think we recycle or divert about 75% of our garbage, and we are very committed to this, but part of it is where are we going to be recycling or diverting. If Measure E passes, then we're going to have to, put our garbage on trucks, ship them out of state. I mean, it's going to be a huge problem for us. Mr. Chesbro has a bill, as one of the opponents mentioned, to increase diversion, the diversion rate up to 75%. Now, if every county puts up a barrier, then where are we going to be able to divert up to 75% of the garbage? And in response to Alameda County exports to 14 other counties. So again, if Measure E passes, Alameda is not going to be able to export their waste as well. So I just wanted to respond to some.
All right. Mr. Manning, did you want to give me a citation here?
I would love to, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And it's on page 5 of the analysis done by Mr. Gregory in 1992.
Just for folks who wonder what we're talking about, this is the August 19th, 1992 opinion letter on solid waste importation county initiative. Yes?
And in the analysis, Mr. Gregory is pointing out a direct quote from the Fort Gratiot Sanitary Landfill, Inc. versus Michigan Department of Natural Resources, which was a U.S. Supreme Court decision, where a county had banned actually the importation of any waste from out of that county. In its decision, the court rejected the argument that the Michigan law did not discriminate against interstate commerce on its face because it treated waste from other Michigan counties no differently than waste from other states, and stated that our prior cases teach us that a state or one of its political subdivisions may not avoid the strictures of the Commerce Clause by curtailing the movement of articles of commerce through subdivisions of the state rather than through the state itself. That quote is directly addresses the issue that discrimination against out-of-county...
I think it's distinguishable. I think what the court here is saying is that you don't get to violate the interstate commerce prohibitions by also prohibiting movement between and among counties. That the mere prohibition on movement between counties doesn't allow you to say, no, we're not discriminating against interstate commerce, we're just discriminating against any commerce at all. So while I think
I beg to disagree.
All right, well, we'll agree to disagree on that. Now, I'm going to look to my staff, who's going to tell me that I have a bill to present in the Natural Resources Committee, and I would ordinarily turn the committee over to another member to chair at this time, but I'm afraid I'm unable to do that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to recess the committee. I apologize for the inconvenience, folks. It's just the nature of the last week. But since it's a wonderful bill, I'm sure I'll be back shortly. We stand in recess.